Welcome to everyone out there tuning in. Today we're taking a deep dive into the mind of one of history's most influential thinkers, Baruch Spinoza.
Definitely a big one.
We're going to be looking at some excerpts from a text about his life and work and really trying to get at, what were his core ideas? And how can those be relevant to us, even all these centuries later?
Yeah, it's amazing how Spinoza's ideas, emerge from this period of just huge intellectual upheaval, the 17th century often called the Golden Age.
Yeah, the text actually mentions Galileo and even Shakespeare.
Yeah.
What were they up to back then, and how does that connect with Spinoza?
Well, imagine, a world where just questioning the church's view of the universe could get you in serious trouble. And that's exactly what Galileo did. He was championing this idea of heliocentrism, so the Earth revolving around the sun and not the other way around as the church, maintained.
So this wasn't just like an academic debate. This was a direct challenge to, the established authority. So how did that impact the kind of like intellectual climate of the time?
I mean, it created this atmosphere of questioning and uncertainty, this sense that the old ways of thinking were really being shaken to their core. And we even see this kind of intellectual angst reflected in the literature of the time. So think of Hamlet's famous "to be or not to be" soliloquy, right? It perfectly captures the era's anxieties.
And Spinoza was born right into the middle of all of this. So he wasn't just pondering these philosophical questions in a vacuum. He was really grappling with them in a world that was undergoing a pretty profound shift.
Exactly. And Spinoza really embodies that spirit of searching for answers. But I think what sets him apart is this unwavering commitment to reason, as the path to understanding. And for Spinoza, understanding wasn't just an intellectual exercise. He saw it as the key to a truly fulfilling life.
I'm seeing a quote here that really intrigued me. It says, "For Spinoza, true knowledge does not imply a renunciation of the pleasures of life." That doesn't sound like, your typical austere philosopher.
No, it doesn't. Spinoza really believed that true knowledge actually enhances our ability to enjoy life. It's not about denying ourselves pleasure, but understanding its nature so we can make choices that lead to lasting happiness.
So it's about being mindful of what truly brings us joy, not just chasing those fleeting pleasures that, ultimately leave us feeling empty.
Precisely. And this idea echoes a core principle we find in Stoic philosophy. So mastering our emotions through understanding rather than suppression.
Now, the text also mentions that Spinoza was pretty critical of this idea of chasing superficial desires. Was he advocating for some kind of like delayed gratification thing where we put off happiness for some kind of, future goal?
Well, it's more nuanced than that. Spinoza believed that we often chase things that don't bring lasting happiness. And that's because we misunderstand our own nature and desires. For him, true knowledge helps us to understand ourselves better so we can align our choices with what truly matters.
Okay, so what did Spinoza believe about human nature itself? What drives us, at our core?
So Spinoza believed that all beings, including humans, are driven by this fundamental force he called conatus. It's often translated as self-preservation, but it's more than just, a survival instinct. It's this striving to persevere in our being, to express our essence, and to become what we are truly capable of.
So it's this inner drive that pushes us to grow, to learn, to, become the best versions of ourselves.
Exactly. And this conatus isn't some kind of static force. It interacts with the world around us with external forces that can either support or hinder our striving.
So how do we react when our conatus is challenged, when we face obstacles or setbacks?
So imagine encountering a force that pushes you off course. Your natural reaction might be to resist, to fight back, to try to maintain control. But Spinoza suggests that true freedom comes from understanding the nature of these forces, both internal and external, and recognizing the necessity of events.
So instead of, constantly battling against the current, we can learn to navigate it with, more understanding and acceptance.
Exactly. For example, think about the experience of loss, right? Which is a universal part of life. It's inherently painful. But Spinoza believed that understanding its inevitability can actually lessen its emotional impact. So by accepting loss as a natural part of existence, we can approach it with more serenity and less resistance.
That's a powerful idea. But it makes me wonder, how do we gain this kind of understanding?
Well, for Spinoza, knowledge wasn't just about accumulating facts. It was about seeing things clearly and rationally, questioning our assumptions, and challenging the very framework through which we view the world. And sometimes that meant challenging authority itself.
And that's where things get really interesting. Spinoza was expelled from the Jewish community for his unconventional views.
Yeah.
And the text mentioned another freethinker named Uriel da Costa, who also faced consequences for, challenging dogma. What was going on there?
Both Spinoza and da Costa represent this inherent tension between individual thought and established beliefs. Challenging dogma, the set of principles laid down by an authority as incontrovertibly true, can be a risky endeavor, especially in a time when religious authority held so much power. Spinoza paid a steep price for his intellectual independence.
So even in a place like 17th century Amsterdam, known for its relative tolerance, there were limits to what you could question. And it seems like Spinoza was willing to cross those limits in his pursuit of truth.
He was, and his willingness to question everything from religious doctrines to the nature of reality itself is what makes his work so compelling, even centuries later. Now, speaking of challenging conventional thinking, let's delve into one of Spinoza's most complex and groundbreaking works, Ethics.
From what I've read, ethics isn't exactly a light read. It seems to cover everything from morality to the nature of reality. Was he trying to create like a whole new system of thought?
He was. What's remarkable about ethics is that it doesn't just focus on ethical questions. It also delves into metaphysics, which is the study of the fundamental nature of reality, as well as logic in the human condition. Spinoza was trying to develop a comprehensive understanding of the universe and our place within it.
And one of his most radical ideas, and perhaps the most challenging to grasp, is this concept of God nature. It seems like he was blurring the lines between, the divine and the natural world.
Spinoza believed that God and nature are not separate entities, but are one and the same. This idea, known as pantheism, challenged traditional religious views that placed God outside of the natural world. For Spinoza, God wasn't some supernatural being who intervenes in human affairs. God was the very fabric of reality itself.
So instead of looking to a deity outside of ourselves for answers, Spinoza suggests that we look to nature, to the world around us, and to our own inner nature to understand the divine.
That's a great way to put it. And this perspective has profound implications for how we view ourselves, the world, and our place within it. But before we explore those implications, let's shift gears a bit and dive into another fascinating aspect of Spinoza's philosophy, the relationship between the mind and body.
This is where I get really curious. Was Spinoza a dualist like Descartes, believing that the mind and body are separate entities, or did he have a different take?
Spinoza actually rejected the idea of mind-body dualism. He saw the mind and body as two sides of the same coin, inextricably intertwined and constantly influencing each other.
It's amazing how modern science often seems to support these seemingly ancient philosophical ideas.
It really is. Today, neuroscience is providing increasing evidence for this deep connection between our mental and physical states. We know that our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are all influenced by this complex interplay of our brains, hormones, nervous systems, even our gut bacteria. Spinoza was onto something centuries ago.
So if our minds and bodies are so interconnected, does that mean that our physical well-being, directly impacts our ability to think clearly and make, rational choices?
That's a great question, and one that Spinoza himself grappled with. He believed that understanding the workings of our bodies and the ways in which they influence our thoughts and emotions is essential for living a fulfilling life. It's all about recognizing the interconnectedness of our being and understanding how to cultivate both physical and mental well-being.
This is making me rethink my whole approach to self-care. It's not just about bubble baths and meditation apps. It's about understanding this complex interplay of my mind and body and making choices that nurture both.
That's exactly the kind of insight that Spinoza hoped to inspire, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface of his rich and complex philosophy.
Well, I'm definitely hooked. I can't wait to dive deeper into Spinoza's ideas about freedom, happiness, and the power of understanding.
Let's do it. There's so much more to explore.
Okay, so we've established that Spinoza wasn't afraid to challenge conventional wisdom, even when it meant facing some pretty serious consequences.
Right.
But what exactly was he challenging? What were these so-called radical ideas that got him into so much trouble?
Well, one of the most controversial aspects of Spinoza's philosophy was his critique of religious authority. He questioned this idea that blind faith or obedience to dogma were the true paths to piety.
So it wasn't necessarily about rejecting religion altogether, but rather redefining what it means to be religious.
Exactly. Spinoza believed that true piety wasn't about adhering to a set of rules or doctrines, but rather about cultivating a deep understanding of nature and the universe, which, remember, for him, were inseparable from God.
That makes sense, given his idea that God and nature are one and the same. But if organized religion wasn't the path to true understanding what was due,
Spinoza saw philosophy and the pursuit of knowledge as the ultimate path to freedom and happiness. He believed that by using reason to understand the world around us and our place within it, we could liberate ourselves from the chains of ignorance and superstition.
That's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
But wasn't Spinoza's philosophy, especially his work ethics, considered to be pretty complex? How could the average person possibly access that kind of understanding? Was he only writing for a select few?
Well, that's a common misconception. While Spinoza's writing can be challenging at times, his core ideas are actually very accessible. He believed that everyone, regardless of their background, has the capacity for reason and understanding.
So it's about developing that inner philosopher within ourselves, regardless of whether we have a formal background in philosophy.
Exactly. For Spinoza, philosophy wasn't about memorizing complex theories or doctrines. It was about actively engaging with the world, questioning our assumptions, and striving to see things clearly and rationally.
It sounds like a call to become more mindful, more aware, and more engaged with the world around us.
Absolutely. And remember Spinoza's belief in the interconnectedness of mind and body. He understood that our physical and mental states are constantly influencing each other.
So it's not enough to just think about these things intellectually. We have to embody them, to live them out in our daily lives. I'm starting to see why Spinoza is still considered such a radical and influential figure centuries later.
His impact on philosophy and even science has been profound. Even today, his ideas about the nature of reality, the interconnectedness of all things, and the power of understanding continue to resonate with people from all walks of life. He was truly ahead of his time.
Okay, before we move on, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea of challenging dogma. Spinoza and Uriel da Costa both face serious consequences for questioning the established beliefs of their time. Could you tell us a bit more about da Costa and what happened to him?
Certainly, da Costa was a Portuguese philosopher and free thinker who challenged the traditional interpretations of Jewish law. He was a contemporary of Spinoza living in Amsterdam during the same period. Da Costa's views, which questioned the immortality of the soul and the divine origin of the Torah, were considered heretical by the Jewish community.
It's hard to imagine facing that kind of backlash for expressing your beliefs. What kind of consequences did da Costa face?
He was excommunicated from the Jewish community and subjected to public humiliation. Da Costa's story is a stark reminder of how dangerous independent thought could be in those times. It also highlights the courage it took for individuals like Spinoza and da Costa to speak their truth, even in the face of opposition.
It makes Spinoza's decision to continue writing and sharing his ideas, even after being expelled from the Jewish community, all the more remarkable.
It does. Spinoza could have easily chosen a life of comfort and conformity, but he was driven by a deeper purpose, a thirst for knowledge, and a desire to share that knowledge with the world. He understood that true freedom comes at a price, and he was willing to pay it.
It's inspiring to think that even centuries later, Spinoza's ideas continue to challenge us to think critically, to question authority, and to live according to our own understanding of truth.
Exactly, and it reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge and understanding is a journey, not a destination. It's a lifelong process of questioning, exploring, and expanding our horizons.
I'm starting to think that maybe we all have an inner Spinoza waiting to be awakened. We all have that capacity to question, to explore, and to make sense of the world around us.
I agree. It's about nurturing that curiosity and allowing ourselves to be challenged by new ideas and perspectives.
Okay, we've talked a lot about Spinoza's ideas, but what about the man himself? What do we know about his personal life, his choices, and the way he lived?
Well, Spinoza's life was in many ways a reflection of his philosophy. He lived simply prioritizing intellectual pursuits over material wealth and social status.
Wait, wasn't he born into a wealthy merchant family? He could have had a life of luxury. Why did he choose a path of simplicity and potential hardship?
Spinoza's relationship with wealth and social status was complex. He was initially involved in the family business, but he increasingly found himself drawn to intellectual pursuits. He eventually renounced his inheritance and chose to live a more modest life, focusing on his studies and writing.
So he was essentially trading a life of material comfort for a life of the mind. That takes a certain kind of courage and conviction.
It does, and remember, this was a time when questioning religious authority could have serious consequences. Spinoza knew the risks, yet he chose to follow his intellectual passions, even if it meant living a more secluded life.
The text mentions that he moved around quite a bit, never settling in one place for too long. Was he restless, or was there something else going on?
Spinoza's choice of residence was actually quite deliberate. He sought out environments that fostered intellectual growth and reflection. He spent time in Amsterdam, Rijnsburg, and eventually settled in The Hague.
The Hague wasn't that a rather conservative city? Why would he choose to live there?
Well, The Hague wasn't exactly a hotbed of radical thought. It offered Spinoza a certain level of stability and freedom. He could focus on his writing and engage in intellectual discourse without facing the same level of scrutiny or persecution he had experienced elsewhere.
So he was strategically choosing his battles, finding a balance between his intellectual pursuits and his personal safety.
Precisely, he was very intentional about how he lived his life, seeking to create an environment that supported his intellectual and spiritual growth. Even the smallest details of his life reflected this intentionality.
The text mentions a fascinating anecdote about Spinoza's bed. Apparently, he inherited his parents' marital bed and insisted on keeping it even after renouncing his inheritance. What's the significance of a bed? I mean, it's just a piece of furniture, right?
For Spinoza, it was more than just a place to sleep. The bed with its curtains that provided a sense of isolation and comfort represented a connection to his roots, to the memory of his parents, and to the continuity of life. It was a tangible symbol of his past, a reminder of where he came from, even as he forged a new path for himself.
I love that, finding meaning in the seemingly mundane. It reminds us that our personal objects, even the most ordinary ones, can hold deep significance and tell stories about who we are.
Absolutely. And speaking of stories, there's a fascinating connection between Spinoza and the famous painter Rembrandt van Rijn. They were both living in Amsterdam around the same time, and some scholars believe that Rembrandt may have even painted a portrait of Spinoza.
Wow, that would be amazing to have your portrait painted by Rembrandt. But was Spinoza really the kind of guy who would want to be immortalized in a painting? He seemed to value simplicity and shun the spotlight.
That's true, and while there's no definitive proof that Rembrandt actually painted Spinoza, the speculation speaks to the intellectual and artistic ferment of Amsterdam at that time. Spinoza, despite his preference for solitude, was part of a vibrant intellectual community, engaging in discussions and exchanging ideas with some of the leading thinkers and artists of his day.
It's fascinating to imagine Spinoza, the philosopher, who championed reason and understanding, living and working amidst this creative energy. It seems like he was both a product of his time and a man who transcended it.
Spinoza was a complex and multifaceted individual, and his legacy continues to inspire and challenge us today. But to truly understand his impact, I think we need to delve deeper into his most profound and influential work ethics.
Okay, let's do it. I'm ready to dive into the heart of Spinoza's philosophy and see what insights we can uncover. All right, let's dive into this. Ethics, it seems like this is where Spinoza really lays out his system, his system of thought.
Yeah.
What makes this work so unique and so important even today?
Well, ethics is groundbreaking for a few reasons. First, it's incredibly ambitious in scope. Spinoza isn't just tackling ethics in the narrow sense, he's exploring the nature of reality, how we think, what it means to be human. It's all connected. Second, Spinoza uses a geometric method. It was inspired by Euclid's Elements to present his arguments.
Geometric method. So he's approaching philosophy like a mathematical proof.
Exactly. He starts with definitions and axioms, things he considers self-evident, and then builds his arguments logically from there. It's a very rigorous and systematic approach.
That sounds intense. But wasn't Spinoza concerned with, making his ideas accessible? It seems like this approach might alienate a lot of readers.
Yeah, that's a valid point. The geometric method can be challenging. But I think Spinoza believed that this rigorous approach was necessary to achieve clarity and precision in his arguments. He wanted to build a solid foundation for his philosophy, and this method allowed him to do that. And remember, even though the format might seem daunting, his core ideas are still very relevant and thought-provoking.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those core ideas. You mentioned that ethics covers a wide range of topics. But what are some of the key takeaways that, our listeners should know about?
Well, one of the central themes of ethics is Spinoza's concept of substance. He argues that there's only one substance, which he identifies with God or nature. Remember that pantheistic view we talked about earlier? This is where he really fleshes it out.
So everything in the universe, from stars and planets to humans and animals, is ultimately a manifestation of this one substance, which is God or nature.
Exactly, and this has profound implications for how we view ourselves and our place in the world. If everything is ultimately a part of this one divine substance, then there's a fundamental interconnectedness between all things.
That makes me think about Spinoza's idea of conatus again, that striving to persevere in being. If everything is interconnected, then our individual striving must somehow be connected to the striving of the whole, right?
That's a very insightful observation. Spinoza does argue that our individual conatus is part of this larger unfolding of nature or God. He sees human actions as part of a grander deterministic order.
Deterministic. So he's saying we don't have free will, that our lives are predetermined.
It's a bit more nuanced than that. Spinoza believed that everything that happens is a necessary consequence of the nature of God or nature. But he also argued that we can increase our freedom by understanding this order by recognizing the causes of things, both in the world and within ourselves.
So it's not about having free will in the sense of being able to choose whatever we want, but rather about understanding the forces that shape our choices and actions, and then using that understanding to live a more fulfilling life.
Exactly. For Spinoza, freedom comes from knowledge, from seeing things clearly and rationally.
I'm starting to see how all these ideas connect. Spinoza's metaphysics, his understanding of the nature of reality, informs his ethics, his views on how we should live. And that understanding is grounded in reason, in a deep and rigorous exploration of the world and ourselves.
That's a great way to sum it up. Spinoza believed that by understanding the nature of God or nature, by recognizing our place within this grand order, and by using reason to guide our actions, we can achieve a kind of freedom and happiness that transcends the limitations of our individual ego.
It's almost like he's offering a roadmap to a more enlightened way of being.
He is. Spinoza's philosophy isn't just a set of abstract ideas, it's a practical guide to living a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
Wow, I'm really struck by the depth and complexity of Spinoza's thought. It's clear that we've only scratched the surface here, but what I'm taking away from this deep dive is that Spinoza challenges us to think differently, to question our assumptions, and to strive for a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
I agree. Spinoza's legacy is a testament to the enduring power of human reason and the transformative potential of seeking truth even when it challenges the status quo.
This has been an incredibly enlightening deep dive. Thank you so much for guiding us through Spinoza's world.
It's been my pleasure.
And for our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about Spinoza's ideas. If you're feeling inspired to learn more, we encourage you to explore ethics and his other writings. It's a journey well worth taking.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.